I want to tell you about how a little film called The Augustas changed my life, and how it is responsible for my being on this stage today. My story begins about 7 years ago when I visited the University of South Carolina's moving image research collections. The building itself isn't much to look at, but the archive itself has a diverse set of holdings. And the archive is one of the top 10 archives of its kind in the nation. On an afternoon, one of its collections features regional home movies shot by people in and around the Southeast. On an afternoon in spring 2008, one of these films lay across a light table where curator Greg Wilsbacher was examining it. As soon as he saw me, he waved me over. He wanted me to look at his find. And indeed, it was a find. For 2 afternoons, I pored over each frame of that strip of celluloid because it was too damaged to thread through a projector. Peering through a magnifying loupe, I examined Augusta after Augusta of a film that I learned was called, aptly so, the Augustas. And that S was really significant. That S indicating more than one Augusta really caused me to think, what is Augusta exactly? And so I ask the same of you. What is Augusta? Now, I know, as you know, that Augusta is the place we are gathered here today for this TEDx event. But what else might Augusta be? What else might the title, The Augustas, suggest, especially to those of us who live in the mobile, connected present? Now, I'm thinking of the pervasiveness of our mobile technologies, our mobile phones, and the types of connections they make possible. How many of us have a mobile phone? How many of us have them with us? I'm assuming that because John has requested, they are not necessarily in the off position, but they are at least silent or vibrating, right? As you are actively doing your Instagramming, Facebooking, and tweeting. Those of us old enough probably have noticed the novelty of this form of connection. At one point or another, we may have caught ourselves noticing that we expect to contact people or navigate unfamiliar places in ways that would never have occurred to us before the mobile phone. Studying such changes in our habits is my stock in trade. And I have learned a lot about our habitual ways of finding things from Augusta and its principal champion, Scott Nixon. A second-generation native Augusta Georgian, Nixon was also an independent insurance agent and a dedicated amateur filmmaker and photographer. Among an extraordinary number of compelling home movies, he left us with the 16-minute reel called The Augustas. Now, the first lesson we learn from this reel is that Augusta names places other than the one we happen to currently occupy. In this one reel, Nixon documents no fewer than 36 instances of Augusta from the 1930s through the 1950s. Clearly, the man's passion for his hometown overspilled its boundaries to fuel this documentary obsession. And obsession is a good word for it, because it is not clear what, other than the filmmaker's interest and insight, causes the Augustas to appear in the order that they do. And this is the second lesson the film teaches us. Augusta provides its own rationale. It is about Augusta. Accordingly, Nixon shows us that Augusta names things other than cities and towns. Augusta refers to a mill, a plantation, a military academy, a fort, a street, and he concludes his film with a delightfully surprising Augusta, which you will see in a moment. In recognition of the beauty of Scott Nixon's footage and the intriguing view of Augusta it presents, the Library of Congress added the film to the National Film Registry in December 2012. For those who may not know or may be unfamiliar with the registry, each year the National Film Preservation Board recommends, and the Librarian of Congress selects 25, only 25, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant films for inclusion on the list. In 2012, Breakfast at Tiffany's starring Audrey Hepburn, and the Wachowski brothers film, The Matrix, were included alongside the Augustas. Now, the Library of Congress preserves a copy of films added to the list to ensure that future generations can experience them. But many films on the list have been preserved and exist in local repositories, and this is in fact the case for the Augustas. The University of South Carolina's Moving Image Research Collections, MERC, has an archival copy of the film and has made a digital version of the film readily accessible on its website. Those connected to the web can search for Nixon or Augustas in MERC's digital repository to study the film at their leisure. Now, I've spent a lot of time with this film, and its playfulness continues to delight me. Nixon's sense of humor shows in its opening title sequence, pilfered, I must say, from a silent film, which warns his spectators to behave. He's got a great sense of timing, too, evident in his framing and editing choices. It is largely through his use of camera and how he edits his materials that Nixon makes the points I outlined earlier. But even so, the film does not document an itinerary or a history. More than that, it's more than a place. It names more than a place. And I think we ultimately come to understand that Augusta is a state of mind. Perhaps the filmmaker wanted us to see Augustas of all sorts as beautiful. At least this is one implication we might make from the decision to end the film with this sequence of images. The hardy phlox Augusta, a flower. But Scott Nixon did not stop here. Indeed, there is at least one other Augusta's reel. As you are noticing, this second reel is much less finished. It is a work in progress. However, we do see a familiar hand at work, for example, in the use of labels to identify Augustas. At the same time, we are confronted with something new, two new Augustas that don't exist in the first film. There is an Augusta in Wisconsin and an aeronautical facility whose sign reads Augusta Aviation. The two Augusta reels quietly urge us to continue Nixon's work by asking ourselves, what other Augustas are there? And we can follow his lead and discover that Augusta names a 19th century Empress of Austria named Caroline Augusta, for whom the flower was named. We might recognize a form of the word Augusta in the 9th month of the calendar, August. And we see its semblance in the name of the Roman Emperor, Caesar Augustus. And if Nixon had had it his way, his daughter would have been named Augusta Georgia Nixon. But his wife did not agree. Scott Nixon's contagious passion for Augusta found a limit when it came to naming his daughter, but still it is contagious. Augusta finding is fun, I think, because it draws attention to the ways we make sense of things. We search, we collect, we organize, we make lists, we count and compare, we categorize, and we label. And rarely do we ever ask ourselves why we do the things we do in the particular ways we do them. Most of the time, the point is simply to do what seems natural, what seems to make sense, whether or not we understand why. But when amateur filmmaking raises the cataloging of Augustas to the level of art, we are invited to reflect on sense-making habits we might otherwise take for granted. Nixon connected Augustas by means of seeking them out on road maps and railway schedules, and one must assume seed catalogs. He then shared those connections with us by means of filmmaking techniques. I have added to these connections by means of Google search, image capture, and PowerPoint presentation. I also worked with colleagues at the University of South Carolina, two of whom are in the audience with me today, to develop an iPhone application that would allow any one of us to continue this project that Nixon has started. Download the free app and you can share as many images of any Augusta that seems somehow significant to you. I hope that people who do this might discover how their habits and Nixon's have what they have in common, but also something about how they might be different. The Augustas can help us understand our mobile connected present. We expect to always be accessible or at least findable because we assume that our devices will work. But being findable, it seems to me, is a question. It is a question because places are not singular. Places are not always identifiable, and our real-time navigational maps frequently lead us to the wrong place, even if we have a strong signal and an exact address. We might think these moments to be instances of failure, but Nixon encourages us to think differently. He demonstrates how supposed technological failure might open up onto creative possibility. His films show us how we too might use our technologies to surprising effect. His example poses a question. What if we understood our devices to be gateways to discovery and expression, as well as tools for efficient travel and communication? Ultimately, I'm speaking about habit and how the two reels of Augustas offer us a means to think about how, for example, habits of interpreting Augusta develop over time, how they become routine expressions that characterize us. At the same time, habits change. We might very well do something other than what is expected or usual. In combination, the two reels confront us with this. That Augusta is a place seems logical to us. Nixon's predilection for identifying such places by means of label or intertitle are familiar to those of us who engage in similar behaviors of documenting and labeling images of places we visit. But such practices are actually quite remarkable, not at all ordinary. Even if Nixon's tendencies to photograph and specify places as Augusta seem oddly familiar to us, even decades later after their compilation, it is not natural. We have learned to perform in these ways as good tourists, as family historians, and as Facebook friends. At the same time, the Augustas demonstrates that how we see something might very well challenge the norm. That is, for example, Augusta may not, in fact, be a place. It may very well be a flower, or even a brick. And this is what's important for us to consider. Augusta matters not because of where it is or how many places it might be, but because of what it reveals about us as people who make connections and who share with others the connections we make. Augusta matters because we think about it in relation to each other, and our collective thinking unites us at the same time. It might very well surprise us. So in the spirit of Scott Nixon, I encourage all of us to engage the world with an active mind and a playful heart. We should attempt to make connections that make others or challenge others to think about the connections they make. And we should be doing so with the various technologies we take for granted. In this way, we might better understand how and why home movies such as the Augustas might be artifacts that merit preservation by our nation's great library. Now, Nixon sets the bar high for those of us who carry the power of web searches and mobile video in our pockets. But his example demonstrates that we have no excuse not to participate actively in shaping how we as a community of thinkers see and understand the world around us. Thank you.